Wow.
What happened?
And welcome to the Real Crusades History live stream event. Sorry about that. That was a little technical difficulty on my end. I am Strider, otherwise known as Rand, presenting along with our founder, J. Stephen Roberts.
Hello, Rand.
And our, of course, redoubtable comrade in arms, Peter. How are you?
Good to be here.
So we're going to be covered tonight. We're going to be talking about the portrayal of the Crusades throughout popular history, throughout popular culture, throughout history. This is a topic that has often come up a lot in our various conversations and dialogue that we've had throughout Real Crusades history's existence, really. And this has been this is often, really, it's through popular culture that a lot of people discover the Crusades. I know it's how I discovered the Crusades. I know it's how a lot of I know Peter and Jay Stephen. I know you both, probably very similar ways. We encountered the Crusades, or at least the imagery of the Crusades, in some form of popular culture around us, either whether it be movies or music. The Crusades, even though they happened, even though the Crusading era properly ended over 800 years ago, they still hold an incredible amount of cultural influence and power, even today. And I think many of our viewers could probably. I think even many of our viewers could admit that this is the same. I mean, we're still talking about this in popular culture. It's still a feature, whether it be negative or positive. It is a phenomenon that is still very much alive in popular culture, and it's not. I think we underestimate. I think especially academics underestimate the power that popular culture and the depictions of historical events in popular culture can be in shaping the perceptions and the attitudes towards various events in history in our own time. Before we get into our discussion, I would open it up to my colleagues here of what did you all see in popular culture that brought you to the Crusades?
The first time I ever heard the word Crusader was I bought a little, I had. You guys remember Playmobil? Those little toy figures.
I very much remember that. Yes.
Yeah, great castle sets. So in a Playmobil catalog, I saw a picture of a Crusader. I didn't know what the word meant, and I asked my parents, and I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." It was a little Teutonic Knight figure.
What did they say, just out of curiosity, when you asked them?
They basically just said, "Oh, that's someone who goes on a quest and fights," which not a bad answer.
Yeah, that in itself is kind of
that's a very accurate depiction in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It kind of shows how crusading has become the quintessential quest. The image, like a crusader, is not just the person who went on the historical crusades. It's this somebody who engages in this great quest or epic.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that was our explanation due to their, especially here in America, just the total lack of knowledge about what the Crusades actually were. But from that, I think it was, seeing Kingdom of Heaven on TV, the story that was portrayed really intrigued me at the time. And then going towards playing the Assassin's Creed games, which focused heavily on a depiction of the Knights Templar. And I immediately was inspired to go look for some books on the Templars to learn about who they really were. And the image presented in the games was totally opposite from who they actually were historically. And from there, I eventually found Real Crusades history, and the rest is history, as they say.
As it were history, yes.
Yeah.
Good. How about you, Jay Stephen?
Well, it's funny you mentioned the Lego figures, Peter, because I remember the very early Lego castle figures were called Crusaders. I think that's probably the first time I encountered that word as like a 4-year-old.
I didn't know that. That's actually really interesting.
That was one of the groups I think was called Crusaders. So that's like a very foggy early memory for me. But then I think I first really learned about the Crusades, in school. I mean, in private Catholic school, and even then it was just very briefly touched on. It really wasn't until I was just getting out of high school and I started reading about Queen Isabella of Spain that I really got intrigued by crusading, because it talked in there about the fact that she was the final crusader in Spain. She was the descendant of the great crusader Fernando III. And, this was in parallel to the crusaders like Godfrey of Bouillon in the East who conquered Jerusalem. And that whole thing just kind of made me, that the idea that this was this broad, cross-continental type of struggle, and that, it went through all these generations, just kind of the scope of it, I think initially drew me in and has kept me fascinated ever since.
Yeah, in one way or another, we all, for lack of a better term, we all had our gateway drug, as it were. Mine. It's funny you mentioned the Lego sets, the medieval Lego sets, because I actually as a kid I had a lot of those, and that was I credit that with being sort of my gateway drug to the medieval period as a whole. And I also when I was young, I was homeschooled for a lot of my younger education, and it was a very classical curriculum, a lot of which used a lot of like young adult fiction from like the 50s and 60s that took place during the medieval period. A lot of stories that were based in the Crusades that generally had a more positive attitude towards the Crusades, and so there were a lot of those, and it led me on this path of just getting into the Crusades, and then a lot of it also was the encountering the very negative depictions of the Crusades, and that it really contrasted a lot with what I experienced as a kid, and there were all these people talking about how this is why, especially as like the War on Terror kicked off and post 9/11, there were all these talks about now we're just making the same mistakes the Crusaders did and all this kind of thing, and it was like, well, hold on, is that really what was going on? Is that really what this was all about? And it wasn't until really diving into the history of it, then we start to, for lack of a better term, start to discover the real Crusades history, as it were. Here we are. Scott, can you hear us?
I'm fine. Can you all hear me?
We can, Scott. We're glad you could join us. I know you had to come in a little bit late, but we're glad to finally have our resident Longshanks in.
Yeah, well, I'm going with Longshanks tonight. Okay.
I wouldn't expect anything different from you, Scott.
Welcome back.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. So we were actually just talking. We were just talking about kind of what was our gateway drug into Crusades history that may or may not have come from popular culture before we got into our.
Really, mine was. There were a lot of movies in the 60s and stuff, but then I really wasn't conscious about like Elle said, but I didn't really know what it was about, just knights and stuff, jousting. But I'd say the first and then of course the Crusades really weren't talked about much in high school, my high school and college history classes. They were just, I wasn't a history major, and they weren't. I guess when I was in architecture school, they talked about the Crusades relevant to the medieval period and stuff. But my real gateway drug were some books I picked up at the library around 1990, written by a lady named Zoe Oldenburg, who was a 50. She was a mid 20th century novelist and intellectual, and I read a couple of her books, and man, I was hooked. And then, but that was kind of like my first cigarette. But then when I read some other books, but what really, I read a couple of other novels and stuff like that about the Crusades, and then Kingdom of Heaven hit. I hate to say that was my main line, but it was. I mean, that really got me going, and if I had to find out what all this was about, and here I am, 15 years later.
Well, we'll have plenty of opportunity to get into some of the films here later on tonight, but we'll go ahead and kick off with our our program discussion here. But so really, what we wanted to do for everybody here, for all our viewers, was to go through kind of the historical portrayal of the Crusades in popular culture throughout the ages. So we do kind of want to go all the way back to when the crusading phenomenon was active and was actually a thing, because there was a lot of that's really where the portrayal of the Crusades in popular history began, was during the times in which it was actively taking place, which was during the what many historians would call the high medieval period. So the 1100s to the 1000, late 11th century to very, very late 13th century, maybe even early 14th century. And you see a lot of the portrayal of the crusade. You see a lot of crusading values and a lot of crusading phenomenon injected into the chanson du guest and the chivalric romances of the time. Probably the one that does this the most would be the chanson de Roland, or as our non-Occitan speaking listeners would know it as the Song of Roland. You see a lot of, even though the actual legend that the Song of Roland is based off of, which is the retreat of Charlemagne and the Carolingian forces out of Pamplona during the I want to say it's like the ninth centuries, 8th or 9th centuries, I can't remember. But and the fact that they were fighting Basques, not Islamic Moors. However, in the Chanson de Roland, what you're seeing in that myth is you're seeing, instead of Basques, they're fighting Moors, and there's very much a sort of a crusading aura around the entire story, and you're seeing the same values, the same crusading impetus behind the Charlemagne's expedition down into Moorish Spain, and whatnot. And I think it's probably, of all the chansons du guest and all the chivalric romances, that's probably the one that really referenced and borrowed very heavily from the from the crusading phenomenon that was taking place at the time that story was written. And you really get to see kind of like it gives you a window into how they saw it, and how important that struggle was, and how highly valued, how highly they valued the crusading phenomenon, and the values that were associated with it. What would you all say?
Yeah, well, I recently read the Song of Roland, and what I got from it was, this is a very you know, contrasted with the sort of modern view on the medieval period, to see a very medieval look at something that happened in recent history was fascinating, because yeah, it does really portray this sort of tragic, heroic spirit of this European knight as he's battling sort of the alien forces in Muslim Spain. So I definitely found that quite fascinating.
And that you get to see, you know, this is it in a lot of ways. The Chanson de Guest were, you know, there was kind of like the, for lack of a better comparison, they were kind of the MCU, you know, of their times. I mean, this was the, you know, this was their mythology. This was how they wanted to portray the cultural values that mattered to them, and this is how they wanted to extol the heroism and uplift the, the story of, you know, good versus evil and good guys and bad guys and all this kind of thing. That really, the Chanson de Guest was where they did that.
The heroic last stand.
Yeah, exactly. And the chivalric values and the knightly principles, and you know, this was their very idealized vision of how they saw it and how they wanted it to be remembered, and how they wanted to portray that entire phenomenon to generations to come.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. You know, we think about the First Crusade as the beginning of this thing, but the First Crusade really was the culmination of a lot of experiences that the Latin West went through in the early Middle Ages. You know, the Saracens and their attacks on Sicily and Spain certainly played a huge role in that, but also the battles with the Vikings. I mean, I was reading a book recently. I can't remember if it was Ferguson or Haywood who was talking about how that was kind of the beginning of the clergy becoming militarized. Like, you've got, you know, the Bishop of Paris kind of facing off against a Viking army, and suddenly he's like in the position of being a, you know, holy warrior. Because I mean, for them, this was very similar to, you know, in fact, you know, we think about the Crusades like this. It wasn't so much a war against Islam as a war against the pagans, you know, and the pagans could take all kinds of forms. The Vikings were a pagan horde, you know, another group of pagans who were threatening Christendom. And, you know, early on, I mean, you read some of this primary source material, like, you know, for King Alfred's battles and for the Viking attacks on Paris and stuff, and you get this very strong idea of, you know, God's people engaged in this righteous battle against a wicked pagan foe. So yeah, I think really the whole experience of the trauma of the invasions of the early Middle Ages, the Vikings, the Magyars, the Saracens. I mean, this is why the First Crusade is kind of happens so naturally in a way. It's like Europe had been forged into this, you know, into this state of mind.
Yeah, it's really interesting you bring that point up, because in a way, you're right. You know, in the centuries preceding the First Crusade, really all of Europe, or all of what would later become identified as Christendom, had really congealed around this concept of, you know, it's God's children versus the others, versus the heathens, versus the pagans, and you're right. They really didn't differentiate that much, whether it was, you know, the pagan Scandinavians, whether it was the pagan Magyars, whether it was the you know, the Moors in Spain, or the Saracens in the Mediterranean. They really did. You know, it really was that clear cut for them culturally, and you're right. I think there really wasn't. The Crusades was a very natural outgrowth of that. You know, of their experience that they had in the previous couple centuries, and that you're right. I think it came to them a lot more naturally than people maybe today want to think it did.
But really, you know, the end of the First Crusade and, you know, moving on into the 12th century is really it all became defined after the First Crusade. You know,
Yeah,
the
that's right.
definition of chivalry, you know, knighthood, all these things became defined institutions after. I mean, I don't even think there was a really clear definition of knighthood until, you know, the mid to late 11th century. I mean, and it wasn't even after until after the First Crusade that it became, you know, like firmly defined or became an institution, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And one other thing I wanted to add was I think later on it kind of became more specifically about this grandiose struggle with Islam. And I think once we read William of Tyre, it's kind of interesting how much he understands Islam. You know, he gives this little, I mean, it's not exactly accurate to the history of Islam, but he gives this, he opens his chronicle talking about Islam. And I guess a lot of that might have to do with the fact that Islam was the enemy that stuck around. You know, the Magyars and the Vikings converted eventually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I, you know, also, you know, Scott mentioned that, you know, that there were institutions, actual social and even political institutions that were formed in the aftermath of the Crusades and during the Crusades. And I think, you know, while no one could ever say that, you know, the Crusades brought about knighthood as an institution. That, you know, that I don't think that would be entirely accurate. No. But you can see the influence of, you know, when you look at the traditional vows of chivalry as they were compiled and solidified, you know, I would say around probably maybe early to mid 13th century was kind of when that became, you know, really truly institutionalized on a wide scale. You can see the influence of at the very least, the status, or at least the social weight that was placed on crusading and the idea of, you know, being God's warrior or the, you know, a warrior in the church's service versus the heathen or the pagan, you know, in defense of God's children or the, you know, the children of the church or whatever. You know, you do very much see that influence there. I think the Crusades had a very lasting effect, or the crusading phenomenon had a very lasting imprint on the formation of knighthood, on the formation of just medieval society in general. Well, and that's where you can talk about. Go ahead, Scott.
Man, I didn't mean to interrupt. No, I was just saying,
you're good.
You know, you get Bernard of Clairvaux and the Templars, and, you know, all this post-First Crusade phenomena that came along. And these really, I mean, it all, you know, helped pull, you know, to create a concept of knighthood or chivalry or whatever, the, you know, holy warrior, that kind of thing in the European mind, where it didn't exist before the First Crusade. I mean, you know, the returning Crusaders were, you know, revered as heroes, you know, that kind of thing. There was a whole cult of you know, knighthood, and it really began to grow in the 11th century, post First Crusade.
And there was a status symbol, you know, that you know, crusading became kind of a status symbol, you know, during the medieval period. They were.
Go ahead.
They were buried differently, you know. I mean, you can tell who is a crusader from their effigies because their legs are crossed. You know, you know, there was there really was a very real status symbol to the concept of going on crusade and taking the cross and going across the sea. You know, that they were revered in society. That was their there very much was a real social and cultural emphasis that was placed upon those who participated in that phenomenon. And it was a very exalted one. It was I kind of like to think that while the crusading phenomenon was actually active, while there was a Frankish presence in Outremer and things like that, that the idea of going on crusade and taking the cross was probably looked at in very ways very similar to the way American society, modern American society likes to look at veterans. It was kind of like this, oh, they're special, they've done this, there was a lot of social and cultural emphasis placed on that and on the people who did that, even the commoners. I would like to imagine that, of the commoners that went off and fought, on a various crusade and lived to actually go home and tell about it. It was kind of like he went across the sea, he took the cross, they're very much in.
Go ahead, Rand. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I was done.
I was just saying, I've often wondered about warrior traditions and peasant families. I mean, that, one generation to another, did they carry the same kind of traditions that the knightly class or above did? Where the men had a tradition of being skilled warriors or skilled men at arms, who some had been crusaders, and those people. I mean, you get all the sources and chronicles are all about the upper classes. You just don't have the records of these guys.
Yeah,
but,
I would say there probably was. We just will never know what they were, unfortunately.
And just to go back to the steps laid down during the pre-Crusading era, before the Crucignati and the Crusader indulgences were solidified, after the First Crusade, I think there was an episode in medieval Spain when Bishop Isidore of Seville, or this was France, maybe, I'm not sure, where he actually did offer some of the warriors who were battling the pagan tribes somewhat of like something akin to an indulgence. Correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen.
Yeah, I think you may be talking about kind of in the middle 11th century, you had popes basically giving what was the Crusade indulgence well before the First Crusade. Like Alexander II gave several. He's the one who did the one for Sicily. Like basically what happened in Sicily is Roger and the Normans they won the Battle of Cerame, and after that, the Pope said, "Hey, you guys get this indulgence for what you're doing there." And I mean, you look at that; that looks a lot like the Crusade indulgence. I think it became more institutionalized later, and then also there was the what's called the Crusade of what was that city? There's a city in Spain. Let me look this up really quick. Crusade of Barbastro. Sorry. Yeah, this was in 1064. And this had an indulgence attached to it. Again, Pope Alexander II, one of the great reforming popes who, Urban II was emulating popes like him. There were a bunch of Normans who were involved in this. The Normans were all in on this early stuff, but yeah, it's kind of intriguing how I remember one time we had Dr. Crawford on. He was talking about that, like how we can maybe make too much of the First Crusade being the strict beginning. I mean, in some ways, this was kind of building up with the Reform movement and all that. But anyway, I hope I'm not derailing the topic too much. I know we're kind of trying to get into the cultural portrayals of the Crusades. And I guess
no, not at all. I mean, that's all really important details to think of. You're right. You're right. I think it was Crawford who said that. But yeah, it's history is never muddling along and then all of a sudden just out of nowhere, a phenomenon just drops on it. There always is a lead up that usually goes at least a couple centuries prior to, when it actually arrives, or at least when it, when people consciously recognize it. So I think probably now is a good time to shift a little bit further in history. So, we've kind of talked about how the Crusades were viewed in their own times when they were actually happening. Then, of course, we have the extremely unfortunate events of 1291. Acre falls, the Frankish presence in Outremer and the Levant is erased, and the medieval world takes on a decidedly different look as it transitions into the 14th and 15th centuries, where crusading, there's a change in the crusading phenomenon and how it's viewed throughout Europe, and there starts to be almost kind of a, for lack of a better term, kind of a disillusionment with it, especially amongst like the commoners. You start to have conflicts like the 100 Years' War and the like, appear in Christendom. You have events like the Great Schism, where even the unity of the church is called into question, because of course during the Great Schism you have at one time 3 different popes, all claiming to be the valid pope all at one time, and you have multiple events that are taking place under the auspices of a crusading indulgence that are really taken against fellow Christians. You have things like like obviously, although this was never, and it should never be considered an actual numbered crusade, but you have what historians call the Fourth Crusade in the early 13th century that resulted in the sacking of Constantinople, even though technically everybody who took part in that was already excommunicated per papal decree, which does not make it an actual official crusade per the terms of as we understand crusading. But starting from there, you have the Albigensian Crusade that takes place within France. You have various crusades called against rival, factions within Christendom, especially during the Great Schism, during the 1390s. You have something called the Dispensers Crusade, which took place in the context of the 100 Years' War, in which you had English armies going up against French-backed Flemish cities that had allegiance to a different pope during the Dispenser or during the Great Schism. So it's just the idea of crusading just became very muddled, and it starts to take on kind of a darker reputation, especially amongst the commoners, and you start to have people beginning to question it. Cultural figures beginning to question it. People like John Wycliffe in England, or Jan Hus in Bohemia. You start to have these almost proto reformers really calling into question, not only the church's authority to grant indulgences and things like crusading, but really just the church's authority in general. Due to the perceived corruption and the perceived abuses of power that they're witnessing during these time periods. And I think that more than anything really started to do a lot to dent the reputation, or at least the popular perception of the Crusades, leading up to the one event that really sends a lot of this down the drain, or at least begins it's circling down the drain, which is the Reformation. In 1513, when Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses on the church door, and now I'm forgetting the name of the town where that happened.
Trier.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think you're bringing up some interesting points. I would maybe highlight a couple of things. I think you're definitely right when you talk about some disillusionment over time with how crusading was used. Like, I think that, for example, when the popes were calling crusades that were kind of against some of their political enemies, there was some cynicism about that. But what I would call attention to is the fact that the ideal of crusading, especially as embodied in like the wars in Spain and the Holy Land, always maintained a pretty consistent resonance with the popular culture, throughout kind of post-medieval or, late medieval and post-medieval Europe. There was this, I mean, it's kind of remarkable, like how this remained the ideal, like the idea of Godfrey of Bouillon, fighting for Jerusalem, and, Saint Fernando capturing Cordoba and all this stuff. I mean, there was always, it's kind of interesting. There was always this very clear idea in the popular conception of what real crusading was. And
I would absolutely agree with that. I would, you are absolutely correct in that there was an ideal that lasted all the way up to, and in certain places in Europe, even past the Reformation, of the ideal of crusading. And that,
and I just want to point out real quick, Lepanto, I think, is one place where we really see how deep this ran. Like, when Lepanto happens, all of a sudden, all over Europe, including a lot of the Protestant areas, there were people talking in this crusading language and celebrating this as kind of like, looking back to these old crusading victories. So I think it's kind of interesting how, while people could kind of be cynical about, maybe the Albigensian stuff and, the Pope's political crusades and all this stuff like that, it's interesting how there was this sense of, okay, well, real crusading, though, is when, we're fighting the real enemies of Christendom. And it's amazing how there was always this strong sense that seemed to prevail of who those enemies were, to the point that even, after the victory at Lepanto, that was celebrated in England, in Protestant England.
Yeah. So. Yeah, you're right. No, and I think that's where, we start to see maybe the split, or maybe the budding off of the realistic implications, or the realistic applications of crusading, or at least like crusading as an actual real politic phenomenon, and the idealism, the nostalgic idealism of the Crusades is during this sort of late medieval, early modern period. Because as one of our viewers reminded, is trying to remind us, our dear listener Dorothy Gaffney, who pointed out that one of the first nostalgic portrayals of the First Crusade, or of the Crusades in general, came from the 16th century. Came from the 1581 poem "Jerusalem Delivered," and I can't remember the name of the full name of the Italian gentleman who composed that, but that there was this idea. I mean, you had conversations of obviously before he broke from Rome and went on his own on his own Anglican adventure. Henry VIII, a young Henry VIII, was having conversations with his with King Francis I of France, about hey, whenever we figure out our geopolitical beefs with each other, let's go on a crusade against the Turks together. There were those kinds of conversations. Henry V of England, of Agincourt and later Shakespeare fame, he had a lifelong ambition to go on crusade and to take the cross and go and go west. Jeanne d'Arc, when she was fighting against the English, one of the things she wrote to John, Duke of Bedford, as she was fighting him, was, she wrote these letters to him, pleading, beseeching that English armies cease their war with France and join with the forces of France to go on crusade against the Hussites, in Bohemia. You know, there very much was still the ideal of crusading present. It's just I think what you saw was the ideal was beginning to become very divorced from the reality of it. And I think the reality of crusading and the idea of, you know, papal indulgences, you know, to go on crusade was starting to was really starting to sour in the popular consciousness, and that's where you start to see, and what we'll get into when we discuss crusading, even, you know, post Reformation, is there really is, except in Catholic countries, or, you know, in Catholic Southern Europe, you really don't see a whole lot about the Crusades at all. In terms of popular culture, there's kind of a great vanishing that occurs after the Reformation. You really do not see any depiction of the Crusades at all in popular culture in the Protestant portions of Europe post Reformation, and it's easy to understand why. I mean, crusading as a phenomenon was very intimately tied to the papacy. It was very intimately tied to the ecclesiastical authority of the Catholic Church, and those nations who had separated themselves from that authority really were not going to look kindly upon something like crusading. It just was not going to be held in very high esteem. You can see this exhibited a lot if anybody is familiar with the writings of an individual named John Foxe. He was a Scottish Calvinist Presbyterian figure who was a prolific writer in the late 16th, early 17th centuries in the British Isles. He actually wrote a couple of historical works, and he refers to the Crusades as these abominable exercises in popery. You know, they were viewed as like these abominable abuses, you know, against the true Christianity, according to them, you know, according to the British Isles reformers, you know, that they were trying to portray. So you really do, except for some very isolated incidents, you really don't see in the post-Reformation, early modern period, you really don't see a whole lot of crusading portrayals in popular culture, except, as J. Stephen mentioned, except in the Southern European cultures, especially those who were still actively engaged with the Ottoman Turks. So Lepanto very much carried a crusading flavor to it. I think they even flew a banner blessed by the Pope, very similar to you know, the Crusaders of old. And then you also see some very, very interesting, or you see some very obvious crusading imagery associated with the relief of the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683 by the Poles and the Holy League outside of the gates of Vienna. You know, there's obviously some very, very close crusading analogies drawn, but yeah. So that's that. In terms of the depiction of the Crusades, it really is split along theological lines, and those that belong to Protestant Northern Europe, you did not see a whole lot at all, as opposed to Catholic Southern Europe, or maybe we should say Habsburg Southern Europe. You still see some, but it's in a very idealized fashion. It no longer really carries the same flavor that it did back when Christendom was religiously united. That's my personal take on it. Does anybody else have a different take, or want to expound on anything further?
I might just say that, yeah, I mean, we might have already touched on it, but yeah, I think the Protestant Reformation introduced a lot of anti-papal attitudes into Europe at the time, and by extension, that would mean that, I mean, Martin Luther said himself that, the Turks are the punishment for our grave sins. And so I can definitely see why that a kind of theology like that would diminish the enthusiasm for the crusading spirit in a civilization like Europe at the time.
Yeah, and again, it's not, it's very understandable, because the phenomenon of crusading was intimately tied to the idea of a papal dispensation for your sins committed, during your time on earth, and that you would in return, you are going out across the sea to fight the enemies of Christendom. Well, when Christendom itself becomes divided, well, that's when the whole concept kind of falls apart. It just isn't. It's no longer a cohesive social and cultural phenomenon. Now it's, in those that still adhere to it, it's more kind of a nostalgic thing. And in those that don't adhere at all to it, it's something that they even react very hostile to. I think you see that oftentimes in the early modern period, in which, many, where Catholics and Protestants were at each other's throats. You had many Protestant nations who even openly allied with the Ottoman Turks against rival Catholic powers.
Catholic countries too, like France.
Yeah, exactly. There were even Catholic powers who allied with the Ottoman Turks in front of so that they could gain a leg up on other rival Catholic powers. I mean, it was just the idea of Christendom presenting this unified front against non-Christendom really kind of falls apart during the post-Reformation, early modern period. And you see that reflected in the popular culture of the time. So kind of moving on a little bit further up the timeline. So now we're kind of getting into the actual modern era. We're, once we get into the 1700s, we're really getting into the modern era. And there, this is under the auspices of the Enlightenment. This is where, ideas of like secularism are starting to, really starting to take root across the West, which is also introducing concepts like secularism, and the idea of, the kind of the divorcing, the great social divorce between the religious and the secular, due to the experiences of, the religious warfare during the early modern era. So it's interesting that in the late 18th century is kind of when you start to see this very glimmer of a resurgence in sort of a romanticized interest in the crusading era, or really just in the medieval era as a whole. And a great example of that is an opera written in 1784 by one Michel Jean Cédin, which was titled Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart. And it turned out to be an extremely popular opera at the time. And it told the story essentially of Richard as he was on his way back from the Third Crusade. You get, Richard is taken prisoner by Leopold of Austria, and the famed troubadour from the time, Blondel, comes and encounters him, and it sort of follows Blondel's adventures into securing Richard's release and ransom, and things like that. It's a very romanticized, very highly fictionalized account of it. But that's where you start to see kind of the rise of the romantic interest in the medieval period, which you will see kick into overdrive in the next century, in the 19th century, with various writers and artists, and this is where I think we can find a lot to talk about, because 18th and 19th century Romanticism really set the stage for how a lot of people think of the medieval period in general, and especially crusading, how they think of it. Like this, it really does come from, especially 19th century sort of romantic nationalism. I think played a major role in this. But you know, I'll open it up to all of you, but you know, this is really where we're getting into the idea of people like Sir Walter Scott, with the Talisman, with Count Robert of Paris, you know, with all the kind of it's really where like the concept of historical fiction really starts to become a thing, and there's this heavily romanticized and yet very ahistorical and oftentimes very biased idea of the medieval period, and especially crusading. But I'll open it up to all of you to kick this off.
Yeah, I kind of look at the 19th century as, you know, this is a point when European civilization has come to dominate the world. You know, technologically, obviously, Europe is at the top. There's this sense of becoming more self-conscious, you know, asking the question of who are we, you know, what is at our root. And I think the Middle Ages, much, you know, as they do for us today, the Middle Ages, we look back at them and it's like this is a period that was more primitive in a lot of ways, but there's also this purity there, you know, without the complications of the more elaborate, technologically advanced, messy modern world. You get these philosophers who talk about this difference between like, okay, well, you know, yes, there's this technological progress that we have now, but in this earlier, more heroic age, there's a vitality, you know, and I think that's the thing. I think there's a truth to it, really. I mean, the one thing about the medieval world is, you know, sort of the dual reactions that people nowadays have is, on the one hand, we're like, wow, I mean, imagine not having modern dental care or no germ theory. But then also people are so drawn in by, you know, the knight and the mode of warfare and, you know, the orders of chivalry and kind of the solemnity of the ceremonies and, you know, kingship and the relationship with the church. I mean, all that, it's very romantic. And, you know, the Middle Ages was a time when a lot of the existential crises that seem to plague kind of the highly urban, you know, almost imperial period we live in, you kind of compare it to the late Roman period, those existential crises weren't there. And so there's this longing for the purity of that period.
Yeah, and especially in a highly romanticized, highly idealized manner, you know, that in a way that oftentimes is, you know, very, you know, almost horrifically, you know, academically inaccurate. You know, I'll leave, since you're the one that has interacted with it the most recent out of all of us, I'll leave a discussion to Sir Walter Scott to you, Jay Stephen, because I know you're midway through rereading the Talisman by him. But you know, there was a very idealized, and I think what you're seeing is, you know, these are people who have, yes, they're the heirs of that culture. They're the heirs of that phenomenon, but they've been so far separated from it culturally and socially and politically that it's really become kind of this exotic thing, and it's almost a legendary thing, almost a mythical thing, you know, and you really start to see that in the 19th century with you know, obviously we've talked about Scott's writings, but you know, you see it in others. You see it in even just the medieval period in general. This very heavily romanticized vision of the crusading era and you know, especially just medievalism as a whole. One of the examples that sticks out in my mind very strongly is when I was in Jerusalem, I stayed in a hostel that was called the Austrian Hostel or the Austrian Hospice in I think it was down the street from the Lion Gate, I think, in the old city. But it was built and funded by Emperor Karl Franz the Elder, not the younger, not the one during World War I, but his father. The Austro-Hungarian emperor during the 19th century, the mid-19th century. And of course, you know, this was during an era when multiple European great powers were all vying to claim the title as protector of the Holy Sepulchre for various political reasons, geopolitical purposes. The Russians, the French, the Austro-Hungarians, you know, we're all vying for that title. And to cement his claim, the Austro-Hungarian emperor in the mid to late 19th century constructed this hospice to, you know, provide shelter for pilgrims that were going to Jerusalem, which was, you know, at the time under the control of the Ottoman Turks, was under the solid control of the Ottoman Turks, and they were never going to relinquish that. Everything that they were doing was just purely political and symbolic. And in the chapel of this hospice, there's this portrait of Emperor Karl Franz, of course, bedecked in medieval attire, and wearing the badges of the Teutonic Order, and surrounding him, almost paying homage to him, are these very 19th century idealized, romanticized versions of medieval crusaders who are all sort of paying homage to him and kind of, you know, with their swords upraised to him and things like that. And it was a really interesting vision, because it was, you know, there was just so much historically and academically wrong with it. You know, it's like, I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't even exist, you know, when the Crusades were actually a thing. But also, you know, it just, the whole thing, you know, very much smacked of kind of 19th century romantic nationalism. And that, I think really what you were seeing was it was people who were mystified and attracted, very genuinely attracted to the crusading phenomenon and the heritage that it left behind, but who also had lived so many centuries apart from when that was actually a thing, that it really did become sort of just this mythical, romanticized thing in their eyes that maybe they didn't truly understand, and were confusing with more modern, you know, concerns that were closer to home. But
yeah, I think that instinct in the Romantic period was a very healthy one. I mean, you know, the truth is that a people's history is vital, and there was this sense of wanting to connect with that. And so I think that was a very healthy instinct. It's kind of in contrast to our own period, in which history seems like almost devoid from our you know, our daily lives. But I think one issue that comes out of the Romantic period is kind of like you were saying, Rand, missing the historical facts of this thing. Like Richard the Lionheart for the 19th century becomes just this kind of semi-mythical figure who just is a guy that rushes into battle and, wins these crazy wars, and he's this kind of like Hercules type figure. Whereas the truth is, the medieval period was a period of history. I mean, this is real stuff. And Richard the Lionheart was a politician. He was a very shrewd politician. He dealt with complicated political issues. He was a man who could, operate very effectively in the council chamber. The medieval world wasn't, what the Romantics imagined it to be. It wasn't just this, for example, the 19th century conception of medieval warfare was just a bunch of guys getting really courageous and just rushing at each other in battle. We, of course, know that's not true. The medieval era was a period of very sophisticated, tactical ideas and the use of military tactics in a way that was just as sophisticated as any other period. So yeah, I think that's kind of what when you read Walter Scott's book, the thing that jumped out to me was that, it starts off, it says, a novel of the history of the Third Crusade and King Richard, blah, blah, blah. You read it, there's like no history anywhere in it. It's just, you've got these figures.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that's the main point I'm trying to make about sort of the 19th century Romantic portrayal of the medieval period and the Crusades in general, whether it's Sir Walter Scott with his Talisman series or Count Robert of Paris or Ivanhoe, or any of the others, is that they because it was such a romantic phenomenon for them, you really lose a lot of the genuine history. And we are still to this day, as an amateur medievalist, I can say one of the worst things that ever happened to medievalism or the study of the medieval period was the 19th century. Because it was just so, it perpetuated so many, ahistorical myths, and misconceptions and misperceptions of the medieval period, that are still present to this day, in terms of popular understanding of them. Another thing I think that needs to be covered is during this period, not all the people who are writing about the Crusading era, especially, writing about the medieval period, especially the Crusading era, are people who shared the same religious background as the Crusading era did. And this is really where, if we're going to talk about Sir Walter Scott was an elder in the Scottish Presbyterian Church. He was also a very strongly practicing Freemason, and those are two institutions that are extremely unfriendly to Catholicism and anything that's sort of associated with Catholicism. And so there's going to be a very palpable bias towards anything that is considered sort of innately associated with Catholicism. And I know there's a lot of our viewers are reminding us that, yes, while Walter Scott was a phenomenal writer and he was a great novelist and he could tell an extremely compelling story, he had an extremely negative attitude towards the Knights Templar. As an institution, he had an extremely negative attitude towards sort of just the medieval church in general, and he portrayed those things very negatively in his books generally. Yes, there's exceptions, and yes, there's individual exceptions, but in general, those are not portrayed, in a positive manner at all. And this is at a time when the Protestant Reformation is several centuries old. So there are certain just cultural biases and cultural things. Also, you have a lot of people who are influenced by Enlightenment thinkers during this time. So you've got people who have sort of an anti-religious bent from the get-go, because they're influenced by people like Voltaire. They're influenced by people like Gibbon, who automatically look at anything that was associated with that was overtly associated with religion, like the Crusades. They're looking at them extremely negatively. They're looking at them as backwards. They're looking at them as sort of these barbarous, figures who ruined, the delicate civilizations and cultures that were already in place. It's kind of where you really start to get the myth of the the Islamic golden age, that was ruined by the fanatical crusaders. And there was another cultural phenomenon in place during the 19th century, and that was that of Orientalism, where it was, there was kind of this idea of like, oh, these mysterious, esoteric Eastern cultures that were so much superior to us, that Western barbarism came in and sort of ruined. That is absolutely Gibbon's take.
And that's when the West starts introducing the idea of the Crusades back into the Middle East during this that colonial period. It comes from that sort of Orientalist exoticization of the other mentality, where they're sort of like apologizing for the Crusades as they're teaching it in their colonial enterprises.
Yes, and also, the colonialism was not it was by no means a cult of the 19th century. It was by no means a collective or a unified cultural phenomenon. I mean, you had people clear back then who were staunchly opposed to it. The people who I think back then would have described themselves as liberals, in the old sense of that word. Who were very opposed to that. And they subscribed to a lot of kind of Enlightenment thinking. And at the same time, they subscribed to kind of this Orientalism of, there were these delicate, fragile, beautiful, esoteric Eastern cultures that, the West kind of came in and ruined. And you see that eventually work its way up through the eras to where, to somebody like, from someone like a Gibbon to someone like a Runciman, who believed that, they were the Eastern Byzantines who were just so refined and cultured, and then these horrible, rough, barbarous Latin Franks came in and just kind of ruined everything.
Well, I think that's a good transition to get into, especially with the mention of Runciman, into the 20th century.
Yeah,
depictions.
Absolutely. And you're going to see, so kind of this, what you're seeing in the 19th century, you're going to see repeated again in the 20th century. It's just what a major difference that between the two is in the medium that it's, or the media that it is depicted in. And with the 20th century, with the advent of the 20th century, you have the advent of the motion picture film. So, if there was any cultural phenomenon that really belongs to the 20th and 21st century, it's the film. And the Crusades, sure enough, make their way onto the silver screen. And I think, while it's worth mentioning, the first time the Crusades actually appear on screen was clear back in 1918. It was an Italian silent film that was based on the 1581 poem, the Conquest of Jerusalem. And it's, in fact, I looked for it. I scoured the internet. I tried to find copies of it, but it's almost impossible to find. So I unfortunately I can't discuss of how accurate or not accurate it is, but really I think, we can choose a selection of films to talk about that depict the Crusading era, or the medieval era as a whole, and their varying impacts on how people view the Crusades and where those impacts and where those, where the ideas behind them came from. Before we get into that, is there anything anybody would like to say as we get into the outset of the 20th and 21st centuries?
Nope.
Silence is consent then. So we'll keep going. So
I'm good to go.
Probably the first film that I think could probably be talked about, just as an example. And of course, we're not going through a comprehensive list. We're kind of going through the ones that at least as far as us, stick out. Probably the first real one to talk about is the film The Crusades, which was directed by Cecil B. DeMille in 1935. It premiered in 1935. It was kind of the, the classic black and white, swashbuckling adventure film. It starred a very young, Loretta Young in it. She plays Berengaria of Navarre. The film setting takes place during the Third Crusade, and Richard the Lionheart is obviously the main character. And it's a really interesting. I don't know how many. I know, Scott, I know you've seen it. J. Steven, I'm positive you've seen it. Peter, I'm honestly not sure.
No.
It's one of those that it's so bad it's almost good.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
It's
on all levels that it's
I mean in terms of historical accuracy, I mean it's like it's in, I mean, if you were to give it a score of for historical accuracy, I mean it's in the negative numbers, I mean it's just completely fictionalized. But it's interesting to see that at that time, it was obviously still very focused on, Richard the Lionheart is the main protagonist. The Crusaders are portrayed as the main protagonists, of the stories, and everything is very dramatized. It's this very, it is an extremely romanticized retelling of the Third Crusade, and I think it's a very Western one. Notice at the time that this is at a time when communism has already become a thing. It's right before the advent of the Second World War. There's obviously other camps out there, but I genuinely believe that DeMille was honestly trying to portray the Crusades as this very romantic, idealized thing. And it just, I don't know where he did his research. I don't know if there was any research done at all. I think he was going off of a high school level understanding of the history of the medieval period, or of the Third Crusade.
Probably going for like an exciting
exactly. He was going for a blockbuster. It's like if Disney today were to try and make a movie about like a historical event. It was just this over the top, almost cartoonish portrayal of that event.
And show too. A lot of subtle sex. It was 1930s style.
Yeah, and obviously they have to stay within the they have to stay within the bounds of the censor board, in place at the time.
Still had a lot of implied. Like here, Berengaria was going to marry Saladin, and she was portrayed as this, kind of seductive maiden in this real skimpy and body clinging costume. And it's just also over the top.
Yeah. It was. It was extremely.
It was characteristic of the time in that way. That's what I'm trying to say. They brought
there's like no history in it at all.
Sexual element, but in real subtle ways.
Yeah.
There's basically no history in it whatsoever. I mean, and a lot of it is clearly inspired by the Talisman. I mean, there's a lot of Talisman-esque plot twists and stuff like that. So yeah, I really hate that movie. I really hate it.
Yeah, I will say this. I mean, it's just it may be bad, it may be horrendous historically, but it is in some ways kind of fun to watch if you're maybe into just watching something that's just so ridiculously campy. I think moving on to a film that also was made right about the same time period, but just from a very, very different perspective, culturally, that I think also still resonates with us to this day, is the film Alexander Nevsky by the Soviet film director Sergei Eisenstein in 1938. This, although the story is very unique in terms of Crusading era stories, because you really don't get a whole lot of depiction, popular cultural depiction as for the Northern Crusades, which is the setting in which the film Alexander Nevsky occurs or takes place. But I think it's more the imagery that is in Alexander Nevsky that really, for better or for worse, I would argue for worse, still very much culturally resonates. Sergei Eisenstein obviously was a film director during the early years of the Soviet Union. He became a major figure during the Stalinist period, and he essentially was trying to depict a sort of a myth of Soviet nationalism that was rooted in the story of Alexander Nevsky, the Prince of Novgorod, as he stood against the Teutonic Order of, the German crusading order of the Teutonic Knights, which ultimately culminated in the Battle of Lake Pepius or the Battle on the Ice in the 1240s. This is a film that has absolutely zero historical accuracy in it. I mean, in fact, it was straight up from first to last a Soviet propaganda film. However,
I was going to say it must have been.
Yeah, but the imagery.
You're talking about Alexander Nevsky. We're talking about pre-1920 here, aren't we?
No. This is Alexander Nevsky aired in 1938. It was literally right in the lead up to the Second World War, and there's a lot of political imagery in this film. The Teutonic Order, especially in the way the Teutonic Order is depicted. The Teutonic Order. I mean, actually, I think you can look up the entire film on YouTube. I think it's open source now, or it's public source. But the depiction of the Teutonic Order in this film, I mean, they are literally like, it's like, okay, he's making the Teutonic Order look like Nazis, look like 1930s Nazis. That's exactly what he's making them look like. I mean, short of Panzer tanks. Yeah, exactly. I mean, even the helmets that like the infantry are wearing look like Stahlhelms. I mean, it's like it's so obvious, what he was going for. And obviously he's depicting the Teutonic Order as these just rapacious, brutal, vicious characters who, they just steamroll into Russia, and they're wiping out entire populations and entire towns, and they're conducting these religious ceremonies that are almost quasi-pagan. And they're like, there's almost like a human sacrifice element involved to it. It's just they're really playing up the idea of like, oh, the German Crusaders are basically analogous to 1930s Hitler era Nazis, and I think you still see that phenomenon even today. In popular culture. I mean, you still see, especially when it comes to the Teutonic Order and the Northern Crusades, you still get the echoes of Sergei Eisenstein and Alexander Nevsky are still very much with us. I mean, I remember I watched a video of an animation concept. It was I'll have to look it up sometime, but it was something studios, but it was supposed to be like a anthology of sort of animation / special effects graphics that was made. I think it was called Oats Studios, I think, on YouTube. And one of the ones that was done was it was based off of the sort of fan art of this one particular Polish graphic artist, and it was kind of this fictionalized retelling of the Northern Crusades, and the Teutonic Order rolls up to this little peasant's shack, while he's got his wife with his infant child. He's obviously this Slavic peasant, and in the background, this gigantic, almost sort of either giant or robot or something that is dressed like a Teutonic knight, and he just looks hellish. Like he carries this gigantic mace, and he's got spines sticking out of his shoulders, and he's got body, actual human bodies impaled on the spines. It's just this hellish looking figure. And I'm watching this. I'm like, this is Sergei. This has Sergei Eisenstein written all over this. Like this has Alexander Nevsky in 1938 written all over this. And this is something that was done in like the mid 2010s. And there's something about the way Eisenstein portrayed the Teutonic Order, the Crusaders of the Teutonic Order, that still resonates, especially in certain parts of the world. I would say, namely the former Soviet sphere of the world, or Eastern Europe and Russia today. I just read an article today that Vladimir Putin just made an address, I want to say a couple of weeks ago, in which he discussed how Russia not only stood up against the hordes from the east, the hordes from the west, the hordes from the east, which to them was the Mongols, but they also stood up to the Crusaders from the west. And it's just the fact that they're still locked in kind of that mindset of these evil Teutonic Crusaders who came in and were just these horrific, almost demonesque figures. That has Sergei Eisenstein written all over it. That was him. And I feel like that's a film that a lot of people don't give a whole lot of credit to when they discuss kind of this negative portrayal of Crusades and Crusaders in modern film. They need to watch Alexander Nevsky, they need to watch Sergei Eisenstein, and they need to see kind of the Soviet portrayal of Crusaders in the form of the Northern Crusades and the Teutonic Order.
One wonders how much basis that has in truth, though.
Oh, I would say it has very little, if any.
In the days when the Teutonic, when they ruled, what was it, Russia and northern areas, the Baltic. How much did that have as a modern? What did Eisenstein's portrayal have? How much of that actually filtered from real, the real history of Teutonic Knights?
Yeah, I would say absolutely none of it. I mean, it was. When you look at the actual history of the Northern Crusades, I mean, you get a much more nuanced view of it. Yes, you did have the idea of the Northern Crusading theater kind of becoming the. I think one of our viewers said it best: the Crusader summer camp of Western Europe. Especially during like the 14th and 15th centuries. Where knights would kind of go for crusading summer trips, because it was so much closer than the Holy Land. But this idea of like them being these, this sort of demonic force, that just brutalized everything in their path. That is 110% the Soviet propaganda.
So you don't
line
think
that comes directly. I mean, I'm sure I'm sure abuses occurred, and I think you can probably find historical.
Would you think
Go ahead,
the
Scott.
earlier Teutonic Knights of being kind of the Nazis of their time for a while?
Absolutely not. In fact, to even make that comparison is just it's almost absurd. We're talking about.
Yes,
no, I said absolutely not.
It was medieval warfare, but it was not any different than the type of medieval warfare that was going on all over the place. I mean, there were conflicts there when the Teutonic Knights got there that were just as rough as what the Teutonic Knights were involved in.
It's kind of like the idea of them ruling with an iron hand for, I don't remember.
I mean, again, no more than anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean,
everybody
ruled. Everybody was ruling with an iron hand during this period. I mean, you know, it
right
was.
now I'm helping Helen with one of her books on World War II, and I'm thinking about Nazis a lot.
Yeah, get out of the 1940s, Scott.
Rattling on about Nazis. That's where it's coming from.
Yeah, it was you know, Alexander Nevsky and Sergei Eisenstein was absolutely trying to make, and in a ways we're going to see this problem again in a lot of modern depictions of the Crusades. But he was trying to make a very contemporary political point using the crusading in the medieval period as a setting that did not actually belong, or was not actually analogous at all historically. And I think that's why the film Alexander Nevsky is so important to understanding the popular depiction of the Crusades in popular culture, because you will see this again and again and again, especially in film. In modern film, but you're going to see this phenomenon again, where they're making these very contemporary political points that don't actually have anything to do with the time period that they're being portrayed in, and I think that's really the reason why I wanted to bring that film up and why I wanted to discuss it, because you see this a lot, like you see this in a lot of the and these are some of the other films we can talk about, but a lot of the Robin Hoods, a lot of the Robin Hood films, you know, of course, everybody goes off this, you know, idea of, you know, the Robin Hood stories taking place during the period of the Third Crusade with Richard I and John I and all that kind of stuff, which is actually very interesting, because the earliest Robin Hood legends actually from medieval England don't take place at all during that time period. It really wasn't until the 18th century that you get a Robin Hood story that takes place during the Third Crusade.
I'm gonna have to jump off, guys.
Oh, what's that?
I'm gonna have to jump off the stream now, guys. Sorry.
No, okay.
It's gotta get the kids in bed.
Oh no, okay. Well, we're sorry to lose you.
No, but make sure you guys do a good job on Kingdom of Heaven, okay?
Oh,
we will. Oh yeah, we will.
Okay.
Nice, Stephen.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Yeah, take care, Stephen.
Bye.
Night.
So, you know, a lot of the Robin Hood films, you see this kind of, this disgruntled Robin, you know, comes back. He's a veteran of the Third Crusade, and he's this like disillusioned veteran. You know, he's kind of like almost like a Vietnam era-esque, you know, veteran, where he's kind of disillusioned with the whole thing and disgusted by it, and it was just the hypocrisy and all that kind of thing. Although, yeah, granted, in like the older Robin Hood, like the 1930s Robin Hood, you don't see that as much. But in the later ones, like the 1990s and onward, that's where you really kind of see that. You see this. The Crusades, they were so, it was just hypocrisy and
in Prince of Thieves, the Moorish character is always depicted as, the more advanced, the more cultured, the more enlightened, tolerant.
You almost get some like 19th century Orientalism, thrown in there for good measure, our non-Western foes were actually so much more enlightened than us and so much better than us and all that kind of thing. And you really do. You kind of get this Vietnam-esque overlay with a lot of those. And this is probably a great point to transition to. And unfortunately, I wish he hadn't left just now, because that was literally where we were going, to our beloved film example of the Crusades that we just absolutely cannot resist beating to a pulp every time we talk about it, The Kingdom of Heaven.
Yes.
The 2006 film by Ridley Scott, or Sir Ridley Scott, however you want to refer to him. It's really the first film that that is really dedicated to the Crusading era and the Frankish presence in the Holy Land, it's really the first one you've really seen directly ever, except for maybe the Crusades, from 1935. This is like the first one that is actually really taking place in the Holy Land during the Crusading period. And, it's here at Real Crusades History. We both love and hate this film. We love it because it was the gateway drug for a lot of people into getting interested in the Crusading era as a whole. I think there's even a lot of our viewers right now who could say that, that was the movie that really first turned them on to the Crusading era. But historically, it is an absolute disaster.
Absolutely.
In every way, shape, and form. And was kind of controversial for that. In fact, I wouldn't say kind of controversial. It absolutely was controversial.
Extremely controversial. We were talking before about the signed letter between multiple Crusades historians, Jonathan Riley Smith, Thomas Madden, Thomas Asbridge, all, like you guys were saying, sort of like written in protest of the film. Like, this is just an absurdity that you've created, Ridley Scott. This is in no way accurate whatsoever. In fact, Riley Smith actually called it, a presentation of Osama bin Laden's version of the Crusades.
Let me
that's how bad.
Peter, as long as you're on the side, did Thomas Asbridge, now, was he actually hired by Ridley Scott as the lead historical consultant, and then
no. In fact, his lead historical
legend or history geek legend or whatever.
No, Peter, do you want to cover this?
Yeah, I just had his name. He hired a very, very pro-Islamist professor of Iranian studies at Columbia University, who has a record of being very anti-Western. And this was basically his go-to for, this sort of biased, one-sided view of the Crusades as, simply Crusaders bad, intolerant, Muslims nice, enlightened, and tolerant.
The one thing I will always say if I give this film any credit at all is the imagery of the film was captivating. It was absolutely, the depiction. I mean, the one that always sticks in everybody's mind is, Baldwin IV, with his silver his silver face mask, and things like that. Like, I mean, it was just such a captivating depiction of that era.
And it helps to put a face to a lot of these historical characters.
I want to add about that, Rand, that one of our very enthusiastic newer members has told me about, there's this whole culture of young girls and women who just like they have these huge crushes on the KOH Baldwin.
Really?
Yeah, it's like a phenomenon.
First time hearing of this.
I know this is the first time hearing about this too.
No, right. Well, it's interesting. It's fascinating. It's a lady named Dee Madsen who has been coming on our show. I think she's a member, and she's been coming on RCH a lot, and we've had some private talks about it. And she's told me about how many fangirls there are of Baldwin in the movie, and the KOH Baldwin.
I kind of feel like I didn't need to know any of that, but
I'm not sure how I feel.
Anyway, that's kind of, it's really true. I'm getting some. It's interesting.
The problem is the problem is, Scott. I'm not surprised.
I mean, have they seen him with his mask off though?
That's true. That's true.
Yeah,
I mean, ladies, he's a leper under that mask.
Oh, lady, looks horrible.
Yeah, we're just so you know, spoiler alert, he's actually got
we
leprosy
know
under
he's
that
a
mask.
leper, but that's the thing that it's a phenomenon about. Well, it's the whole image that Baldwin presents throughout the film. The whole
Yeah.
character. It's not just
Yes.
he's
Yeah, and he
vulnerable, he's strong, he's sensitive. He's a guy that women want to take care of.
I'll take your word for it, Scott. But but at the same time, I can actually see that. Like I can, because they do portray him as this very sort of esoteric. He's very he's very wise. He's very vulnerable. He's very he is, and I'm not gonna lie. Like I was very intrigued by his depiction. I mean, he almost made the film for me. Like he almost, if the film had just been about him, I honestly would have been way more interested in that and would have had a much different opinion about it.
He was capable of carrying a whole film, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And Edward Norton did a very good job with that character.
It's just think the whole cast was good, actually. That
no.
We have it was a lot better than a lot of movies.
To be fair, it was kind of an all-star cast. I mean, you've got people like Liam Neeson, Jeremy Irons, Brendan Gleeson, Orlando Bloom.
They all gave individually good performances, I think.
But just the writing and directing was so horrendous that it made it impossible for us to look past. They might have been able to give like the most beautiful performance of their career, but it's just
I kind of wanted to make or force Orlando Bloom somehow to take a knee and punch himself in the face after that movie, but that's just me. And I don't even mean from the historical perspective. I just mean like in general. Like I just feel like his depiction of Balian of Ibelin was just so horrendously bad.
Yeah.
And so tacky and so just nauseating that I just kind of want to reach through the screen and punch him in the face until I can't punch him more.
He is such like he's almost like a soy boy kind of character. I mean,
thank you.
Thank you. Like that, the speech he gives before the Muslims breach the. That's all right. Before the Muslims breached the walls of Jerusalem at the end, his speech is so uninspiring and just like we had just seen his his co-star. Viggo Mortensen give the Stand Men of the West speech 2 years earlier, and so, but he just basically is like,
we don't know what we're fighting for. This is all BS.
Right. And if you don't fight, your wives and children will die. And I say, let them come.
Yeah. It's like, wow, bro, really? That's it? Like, Kingdom of Heaven really is in a class unto itself, in a lot of ways. And while I appreciate it for giving the Crusading era some visuals that people can actually put a face to when they think of the Frankish experience in Outremer during the Crusading era, it's just so bad.
Here's two things I want to say about it.
It's so bad.
First off,
it is bad.
Kingdom of Heaven is essentially, I think it's the ultimate culmination of sort of postmodern, cynical view of the Crusading period and the medieval period in general. Yes. It's historically inaccurate, but it's also, I mean, this film this is a post 9/11 film, right? We're in the middle of the War on Terror, this clash of civilizations. And so a lot of people in the West, because of this sort of obsession with, always wanting to defend Islam and portraying it in a good light, Ridley Scott has to make the Western Crusaders be these sort of barbaric, backwards, greedy, stupid, bigoted, just awful people. And, someone like Saladin being this 19th century liberal gentleman who is so tolerant that, the cross that had fallen on the floor during the siege of Jerusalem, he graciously puts back up out of respect.
That was
like at this point, you're no longer even trying to depict history. This is you're just trying to get your viewers to accept the idea that somehow Islam has always been this incredibly tolerant, advanced ideology, and it's really us who are the
and even the
Jerusalem. You know, Heraclius, he's just portrayed as just this complete idiot.
Right.
Well, and not only an idiot, but just a scathing hypocrite. Like you know, just a vicious hypocrite who you know just is even willing to turn on his own faith. You know, and it was just like, wow, really? Like, you know, and you know, Balian of, you know, Orlando's Balian of Ibelin, you know,
right, losing his faith.
You've taught me much about religion this day, Archbishop. Like, really? Like, who in the late 1100s would have even talked like that?
I know,
you know, like
it's so out of place.
The other thing that always killed me about Kingdom of Heaven was it was kind of like, okay, what was even your point of making this? Because at the very end, you get this you know, screen text at the end of like, and they are still fighting over the Kingdom of Heaven to this day. And it was like, hold up, wait, what? Like, what is this, like an anti-Israel thing? Like, what is going on here? Like, what point were you trying to make with this? You know, like what other than you know, Western Christian Crusaders bad, Muslims good. You know, like, I mean, that was like, I mean, that's really, that was it. And it just didn't even work artistically. Like, I didn't even feel like, yes, while it may have been horrendous in terms of historical accuracy, while it may have been while it may have been engaging with its visuals, you know, at least it was an engaging story. Like, I didn't even feel that.
No.
You know, like, I didn't, like, at the end of it, I just kind of, and even when I watched it again a couple months ago, when I subjected myself to it a couple months ago, it was like I got to the end of it, and it was just like, again, I was just like, okay, what was the point of this? Like, what?
Yeah.
It
what
left
was
me
I even
feeling
supposed to take away from this?
It left me feeling very empty.
Yeah, exactly. It was very disappointing. And I guess if we have to give it, if we have to wrap up, because I know we've got some other things that we want to talk about. We don't want to sit here and just turn this into a bash on Kingdom of Heaven. But yes, it was a lot of people's gateway drug into the Crusading era, into visualizing the Crusading era. It did definitely put some faces onto some very important figures from that particular period. But in every other sense, that movie was an absolute and utter disaster.
Well, now I think now we have a comment on chat that said, you know, that one thing we can take out. Well, I mean, there are a lot of wrong things that you know, what Baldwin did or whatever. I mean, that would be historically not correct, but it was just the overall image he presented. I mean, he really carried the part and made himself, you know, made a noble person out of Baldwin.
Anyway, so
kind of, I guess. I don't know. Like,
no, really, I'm talking broad brush. I mean, I'm talking about, you know, rather than painting detail, we're painting with a big brush. And, you know, we get
in maybe a postmodern secularist sense, maybe. But
no, not even that. It's getting into his just his physical being and you know, the way he was depicted visually and that.
You mean the fact that they had him played by a 30-year-old guy, even though in real life he was pushing 60, you know, when that event really happened?
Right.
You know, well, I mean, that's, you know, again, like,
I thought he did. If there were good performances in the movie, his was good, and there were other good ones, but it just didn't work. You know, the whole thing didn't work. I guess maybe I'm more charitable than you are.
And that's why we keep you around. That's why we keep you around, Scott. You're the you're the more charitable voice.
So I think I think the last like notable piece of cinema regarding the Crusades would be Arn the Knight Templar.
Yes,
I've never seen.
Yes, I've seen the first one, which is that's the one where he's actually in the Holy Land, where he's actually serving as a Knights Templar. So a little bit of background for any of our viewers who aren't familiar. In 2007, there was a Swedish film that by a Swedish director and mostly starring a Swedish cast, and it was based on a series of historical novels written by a Swedish author who it basically follows this young Swede whose name is Arn during the kind of mid to late 1100s, who he, due to conflicts back at home in Sweden, he becomes a brother of the Knights Templar, and he gets sent out to the Holy Land. He gets sent out to Jerusalem to serve in the Templar Order, as a Knight Templar in Crusading era Jerusalem. Very, very good stories, very, very good movies, and a much more balanced view compared to Kingdom of Heaven. And this is why a lot of medievalists prefer the Arn Templar series over something like Kingdom of Heaven, because it is historically a lot more accurate, and it is a much more balanced view.
Scathing review of it today that you need to read, Randy.
I know, and here's where the difficulty is. The books apparently carried a lot more cultural weight than the films did.
Well, apparently there was a lot of big mistakes in the film that I didn't know.
Oh no, absolutely, and having been someone who's seen the first Arn film, historically they are not good either.
Right.
However, I think the reason why a lot of medievalists tend to like that one better is just because it at least portrayed a more balanced view of the Crusading period in Outremer, and portrayed portrayed as a little bit more heroic. It actually portrayed Templars as good guys, with the exception of like Gerard Aurifour.
Yeah, he was
people like that, but like
he was maybe just an idiot.
Yeah, but it at least at least it wasn't the just cartoonishly bad portrayal that you get in Kingdom of Heaven. At least in the Arn films, at least it was somewhat more balanced in its portrayal, and even that may even be just a little bit of kind of like the the abused spouse syndrome, the battered spouse syndrome of, like we're just used to so much that is just so overtly bad and negative that, even just the little bit, that we get, the crumbs that we get, we sort of assign disproportionate value to.
The bar wasn't high to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. It's not hard to improve on garbage. So it's weird that those two films have been set up as sort of contrasted with each other, even though I would argue from a historical standpoint, they're kind of both garbage.
But it's good they got made, because that's one of the reasons we're talking right now. And all these
Absolutely. Well, it's a lot of reasons why real Crusades history as a whole exists. Like I cannot tell you how many people
where credit's due.
Yeah, I cannot tell you how many people I've seen who join Real Crusades, and they talk about, I watched Arn the Knight Templar, or I watched Kingdom of Heaven, or I watched or I read the books, or whatever.
Right.
And that's kind of where they're. I know we've abused this term to death tonight, but it's kind of where their gateway drug into the Crusading era came from. And it's it for better or for worse, unfortunately, as of now, it's what we have. I would like to think, at least in terms of film, it is getting better, maybe
I'd
marginally.
like to see what happens with Steve.
Well, and again, I'm sad we lost him, because I was kind of thinking he was going to make a plug for his show. Although I think a lot of our viewers have seen his other promotions for the show that he's making. At the same time, I think there's also a change in how the medieval era in general is being portrayed, which is as a much more balanced, much more accurate view. Probably one of the films that stands out at the forefront of my mind is the Netflix film, The Outlaw King.
Right.
You like that, Rand?
Robert the Bruce. I very much liked that. I was very impressed with that. I was, especially from a historical perspective. And I liked how, the Crusades, although they didn't feature very heavily in that, I liked how they were discussed. There wasn't the postmodern disillusionment or, the Crusades, they were so bad. It wasn't there. They just talked about, and they portrayed the fact that Edward I was a Crusader, and that Robert the Bruce's father, Robert de Bruce the Senior, had gone on crusade with him, and that they shared that bond, and that meant something to them, that they were, even though one was English and another was Scottish, that
I might watch that tonight, actually.
Yeah, that they still shared a very intimate personal bond with each other because they had both been on crusade together, and that meant something, and that was a very important aspect of their relationship, and they remembered that very fondly, and they remembered that very respectfully. And that's portrayed that way in the film. There isn't the that you don't get the postmodern secularist political BS that you usually get in a lot of other depictions in that. You get this very authentically medieval depiction of how they would have discussed it, how it would have meant to them in that time.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to rewatch it, Rand.
Yeah, and it was phenomenally well done and well made, and I think that really is the future of the depiction of the medieval period in film. I think that is what will eventually become the trend. I don't want to spend all this time talking about film. I know there's other media that I think some others want to discuss. Peter, I'm going to let you kind of take the reins with that, and
Sure.
we'll continue discussing in that vein here for the next probably 10 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and call this to a close.
Yeah, I wanted to briefly touch upon two types of media that have featured heavily in sort of depiction of the Crusades in pop culture, both in music and in gaming. So I think I'll talk about gaming first. There have been quite a few depictions, for as long as I've been alive that I've seen. I'll start with the bad one, which I think most of our viewers who have come to this channel for this reason, to see the historical accuracy of, would be Assassin's Creed, that series. So for those who don't really know what Assassin's Creed was all about, Assassin's Creed was this very innovative, very fun, and impressively well put together stealth assassination game where you play as sort of like you basically play as an Ishmaeli assassin who goes out, seeking out targets. But the creators of the game decided to, I guess they were going with sort of the idea of like the Knights Templar conspiracy, the idea that the Knights Templar are the secret fraternal order that is, secretly controlling the world, similar to the Illuminati or the Freemasons. And they're at this internal war with the assassins, who are, both of these groups are like have no religious connotations whatsoever. The Templars are portrayed much like in Kingdom of Heaven as, these hypocritical, impious, disingenuous figures who are really only in it for the power to control world governments and to restrict the freedom of others. The assassins are their opposite. They're also basically atheists who are trying to stop them. And it's just sort of like a really, again, like an anachronistic sort of fantasy-driven narrative about the Templars and the Assassins, which is so far away from what the actual relationship between the two groups was during the actual historical period of the Crusades. And that's what inspired me, like I said in the beginning, to actually investigate the Templars and see that they were literally the opposite of all of those things. I mean, I guess, according to Ubisoft, the developers of the game, they must have thought like this Templar conspiracy made for good storytelling. But it's definitely not something you would look to for an accurate depiction of the Templars. The good side of gaming would be a game like Medieval Total War, which is an RTS where you are given control of an entire kingdom. And they came up with an expansion set in the Crusades period where you get to control the King of Jerusalem, the King of Antioch, the Byzantine Empire, the Egyptians under Saladin, and the Turks. And that, for the most part, was really a really balanced, really fairly accurate depiction of the events there. Even down to like sort of the units, the names of units. Like you can control a unit called the Constable of Jerusalem. You can control the Marshal of the Templars. They include things like the Maronites of Lebanon. There's Armenian mercenaries. They definitely put a lot more thought into it. So
now, these are main, okay, except for Assassin. You're talking strategy type games. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that correct, Peter?
Yeah. And there's some other games. Other than those two, I think these are the two most memorable games set during the Crusading period.
I know I'm thinking about some of the more slasher type, combat type medieval games like Chivalry and Mordhau and things like that.
Yeah, well, a lot of people are, creating mods on games like Mountain Blade and Mordhau, and where you can play as like a Knight Templar or a Saracen.
They don't really go into anything. They're all really set in kind of this fantasy worlds or fantasy worlds or not but worlds that aren't real. There's nothing to do with the Crusades except maybe a little. Even the armor is goofy. I mean, it's
yeah. I would say the most accurate depiction has been in the strategy games for sure, because in a game like that, you really need to pay attention to detail when you're creating a simulation of the political landscape.
Well, and you see it in strategic games like Medieval 2 Total War, where like the Crusades feature very, very heavily in that. And not necessarily in a negative way. It's just kind of a very realpolitik. Hey, this is, you can join it, you cannot, you can use it to your advantage, you cannot, you can be as idealistic or as utilitarian as you want with it. It's really up to the player. But in terms of the actual history, they're fairly benign with it. And you're right. I unfortunately I wasn't able to be here for the full discussion of the Assassin's Creed series, and I hope I'm not stepping on your feet at all, Peter. But that again was a very I think that very much belonged in the camp of sort of Kingdom of Heaven and the Talisman. And,
a lot of postmodern cynicism.
Yes, exactly.
Religion is a farce. It's, either it has to do with like, an ancient conspiracy meant to deceive people into buying into whatever, world government they're trying to create, or just the people who espouse it at the top are just fraudulent.
I felt like Assassin's Creed is what would have happened if the guy who did Zeitgeist read about the Crusades. It had very much kind of this zeitgeisty kind of feel, all religion's a lie, and it's all just a conspiracy to keep everybody controlled, which in a post-enlightenment, post-secular world is just kind of ridiculously laughable. But
upon further inspection.
Yeah, and it did kind of follow a lot of tropes of Western Christian bad, non-Christian Eastern good, kind of. I mean, I think in one of them, I think it's the one that takes place during the Renaissance, during the early modern Renaissance period. Suleiman the Magnificent is like this positive hero. There's like this positive figure in it, and he's like helping the assassins against the evil, Templars who are like basically represented by the papacy.
And the remaining Byzantines are associated with the evil Templars.
Yeah, and it's just like, wow, really? Like, I mean, why don't you just come out and say it? Why don't you just be honest about it?
Yeah.
I think video games has a much more varied experience than film. I think you have a lot more. I think you've got plenty of video games that portray it in a very positive light. You have other video games that just try to portray it in a much more, objectively historical light, and then you've got others that, like the Assassin's Creed series that portray it in a very negative light. So
overall, I think video games do it better as of now.
Yes. Yes,
and because there's freedom to do that kind of thing. It's like your own creation. Like someone with game design skills can create a very historically accurate game.
Yep.
Now I want to move on briefly to some music about the Crusades. So most of the music that I know of that relates to the Crusades is heavy metal, which is
weird. You wouldn't, I mean, I guess it is. It is kind of fitting, but it's weird to think that that's the genre that you typically find.
It's fitting. It's fitting because heavy metal has always had a fascination with history, with heroic warriors, with these stories of courage and just violence in general. Any way to depict like the carnage
phenomenon.
Yeah, the carnage of war. You see that kind of thing all the time.
Yeah.
So like. I think maybe the earliest song came out in 1981 from the British band Saxon. They were a classic new wave British heavy metal band. Actually, the song Crusader that they wrote came off of their album called Crusader. And the album cover is basically a knight on horseback, in front of a bunch of soldiers with him. And this song is a very much, very positive look on the Crusades. It's much more it's like a Crusader anthem in a way.
Yeah.
Like I'll read some of the lyrics here. To fight with you over the sea, they're calling. I have to be there. The Holy Land has to be free. Fight the good fight, believe what is right. Crusader, Lord of the realm. Fight the good fight with all your might. Crusader, Lord of the realm. Also,
it almost kind of goes back to kind of like the old like chanson de guerre.
Exactly.
Kind of that sort of idealized heroic ideal that was much more present during the medieval period, and kind of how a lot of them saw themselves. So it's interesting that you're right. You do kind of see this weird resurrection within the realm of epic thrash or epic metal music, and of course I'm sure we're going to get into. I don't think anybody could talk about this without talking about the band Sabaton.
Oh, we'll get into that.
Yeah, because that's the one that like everybody knows.
But like speaking of like how they saw themselves at the time, and like how I think for lack of a better word, the fans in the medieval days of the Crusaders. Another line is like, we Christians are coming with swords held on high, united by faith and the cause. The Saracen heathen will soon taste our steel. Our standards will rise across the land. I mean, that's just like very direct. But what I also like about this, it's these guys, when they were writing the song, were paying attention to history. Like they understand terms like Saracen, the pagan from the East, Christendom, all these kinds of things. So it's almost like kind of like a patriotic kind of song.
In a way, I feel like it's really just kind of a modern resurrection of the way I think that a lot of the medievals from that era would have talked about it themselves. It is kind of going back to the chivalric romances, the chanson de guerre. It's just with an electric guitar instead of a lyre, you know.
Yeah, exactly. The modern day bards, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And it's why it's kind of fascinating in that respect, because there's not a whole lot of difference.
Before I get into, unfortunately, with, you know, just like with film and video games, there are also negative portrayals of
absolutely
of the Crusades in this genre of music. But before that, I want to touch on some other positive looks. Of course, so you brought up Sabaton, great example. I remember a number of years ago, somebody made a music video. It was a compilation of footage from Kingdom of Heaven and Arm the Knight Templar. Just like some of the cool battle scenes, basically.
I've seen
as you could make them.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I've seen it. Yeah.
And this went along with the song "The Last Stand" from the album of the same name. And it does the lyrics, because like the lyrics are basically, you know, there's a lot of references to the Holy See, defending the Holy League, salvation, damnation, all these kinds of things. What's interesting, and I wanted to ask you about this, Rand, if there's any connection maybe to like the idea of crusading. The song is actually about the last stand of the Swiss Guards in 1527.
Yes.
Dealing with Charles V, the sort of treacherous monarch who sacked Rome at the time. And these Swiss Guards were like the defenders of the Holy See, the defenders of Christianity. Mm. So to you, is there any sort of connection with crusading or the idea at the time?
No, not at all. That conflict was a lot messier and a lot less clear cut back when it actually occurred. So that was for a little bit of background. So yeah, the sack of Rome in the 1520s by the forces of Charles V, by Emperor Charles V, the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, who was Catholic and who saw himself as a champion of Catholicism. However, the Reformation had just happened. There were a lot of his German troops were dedicated Lutherans. It was kind of a weird situation where you had a lot of Spanish troops and a lot of German troops. The Spanish troops obviously were Catholic. The German troops were mostly Protestant. And they were all on the same side because they were all being paid by the same paymaster. And essentially, the imperial forces of Charles V moved in to occupy Rome purely on for political purposes. It was kind of the last real conflict between Pope and Emperor, Pope and Holy Roman Emperor, that had been going on literally since the creation of the Holy Roman Empire, clear back in Charlemagne's time. It was not supposed to go the way it went. Essentially, it was kind of one of those like unforeseen consequences that sort of snowballed out of everybody's control. And essentially, it was a bunch of troops who the discipline fell apart once they started occupying Rome, and they just wanted to get paid because the Habsburg commander, I can't recall his name, died. And so basically you just had a complete breakdown in discipline. The troops ran wild through Rome. They took everything they could get. And of course, where was the vast majority of the wealth in Rome at that time? It was in the Vatican. So they made a beeline for the Vatican. And this is where the 100 or so Swiss guards that were there at the time, they were just a bunch of Swiss mercenaries, Swiss halberdmen, who, some of the most feared professional soldiers and professional mercenaries in Europe at that time.
Right.
We're like, you know what? We have they had a reputation to maintain. The Swiss had a reputation for being faithful to their employers, even to the last man. And they had no intentions of shaming that reputation. So they did. They literally died to a man right there off the side of St. Peter's, of what is now St. Peter's Square. It's over in it's actually a little courtyard. It's in it used to be the German consulate in the Vatican, but now it's I think it's like an academic building now. And it's in the courtyard of it, there's a cemetery, and in that courtyard cemetery, that's where the Swiss made their final stand. And they were literally by both the Catholic Spanish and Protestant German troops of imperial troops, they were literally annihilated to a man. They died to a man in that courtyards. But in terms of like, was that associated with crusading? No. However, has Sabaton, has the band Sabaton forever associated that with sort of, this, the last stand of the West,
Right.
Kind of imagery? Yes. And it's kind of funny that they've done that, because in the real history of that, that's not really at all what was happening.
Yeah. I'm not sure if they did that or it was more so the fans.
I think it was. I think it was both. I mean, you can't listen to that song by Sabaton and not get that impression, as I have multiple times. It's a very rousing song, and it's. I think they were very inspired by that. In fact, I think if I read, I want to say I read an interview years and years ago with some of the band members of Sabaton, and they were talking about that song, and they talked about, I think one of the times they were in Rome, they actually went to the memorial that's in the Vatican Gardens to the Swiss guards who died in 1527, and they were so inspired by it. They just it's the Lion of Lucerne, and they were very, very inspired by that memorial, and that's what inspired them to write the song. And because it kind of is a Thermopylae Alamo-esque story, of these 100 or so Swiss mercenaries who literally die to a man, defending the Holy See. Never mind the fact that half the people they were defending it from were fellow Catholics, but it's a very rousing story, and it's even still a rousing story in the Vatican, within the Vatican. The Swiss Guard to this day, the oath they take when they become part of the Swiss Guard actually comes from 1527. It comes from the oath that the original corps of Swiss mercenaries took when they took on service in the Vatican. So it resonates. Even though the details of the history are far messier and far more complex and far more nuanced, it is something that resonates, and I think that's the impulse that Sabaton was tapping into.
It is interesting. The next song on that record is a song that is much more akin to that actual last stand of the West in terms of the civilizational war between Islam and Christianity. This is the song "Winged Hussars."
Yes.
Obviously this is about the lifting of the siege of Vienna in 1683. Was it?
Yes, 1683.
1683. Yeah, and so ironically, it's the less popular song that actually has that spirit you were describing, Rand. But yeah, no, I think overall, Saxon, Sabaton is a band that really takes historical authenticity seriously, and they relish in that. And that's, they sing songs of inspiring heroism, and it's, for most of their career, they focused on modern conflicts, Second World War, First World War.
Yep.
So it's good to see them, sort of delve into the medieval period.
Yeah, I cannot tell you how many memes I've seen in which the refrain "and the winged hussars arrived," played by Sabaton, is blasting in the background. It's just
you gotta send me one of those.
It's oh yeah, they're everywhere. I've seen them multiple times, but. I think this is our longest live stream that we've ever done. That's I think we've broken our record at. Can I just go
on for a few more minutes before we start?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool. Last two positive looks that were notable to me were a song by a band called Symphony X called The Accolade. And I was really pleasantly surprised that this song is basically about the Knights Templar. It's a much more like romanticized mythological version or interpretation of them. But I mean, you can tell. I mean, it's a very melodic song.
Okay.
Lyrics like "Sons of Antioch, an angel's voice cries out to him, free the holy lands, bring peace to it again. Across the seas, through sands of time, Knight of the Templar." You know, this is so it's very much, you know, sort of akin to the Saxon Sabaton theme of this. And another band, a Swedish power metal band called Hammerfall.
Yes, I've heard of them.
They invoke Templar imagery a lot. Like, they call themselves the Templars. They're singing about the Templars, like the Templars are back on the streets. So a lot of that imagery is popular in the heavy metal genre. It's just, you know, whenever I hear lyrics like that, I get really excited.
Yeah.
Now briefly onto like the negative depictions of it in metal. So there's a band from Brazil called Angra, and they released a concept album that is basically like the heavy metal concept album version of Kingdom of Heaven. It's basically this like really ridiculous story about like this European who's falls in love with a Muslim woman and is basically fighting against the Crusaders and the Roman Catholic Church, basically a critique of them, sort of like questioning the ideals and the hypocrisy. And they really focus in on one song about, you know, the siege of Jerusalem and how, you know, they're basically saying the entire population of the holy city was put to the sword, you know, this sort of just merciless killing. Very, you know, this came out around the same time as Kingdom of Heaven, so it's a very sort of like, I dare say, propagandistic look at.
And I do know there is a genre of like pagan metal that you know, you've got like a lot of Northern European you know, bands that are a part of that, and I know I can't remember the group, but I remember seeing the music video for one, and it was sort of again, it was like taking place within the context of the Northern Crusades. You know, the villains were the Teutonic Order. The good guys were, you know, the pagan Lithuanians. You know, and they were, you know, it's essentially them, you know, finding a way to strike back, you know, at these obviously very Sergei Eisenstein-esque, you know, Teutonic knights, you know, and all that kind of thing, and kicking out, you know, the evil, oppressive Christian, you know, crusaders and things like that. So I can't, like I said, I can't recall the name of the band, but you know I've seen that before, and I do know that there is such a thing as like sort of you know, this genre of pagan metal. You know, that is very anti-Christian, very very has a very skewed view of like the medieval period. A
similar thing is presented in the last thing I'll talk about is this song called "Poor Man's Crusade" by a band called Demons and Wizards. This is basically just another example of postmodern cynicism shining through. It's essentially just saying, like, you know, all these men on the crusade are being duped by the church, you know, into just slaughtering for the sake of their own enrichment. You know, saying things like, describing like a clergyman as holy and bright, he's a devil in disguise, protector of the cross, beware of the snake. This is all just a poor man's crusade, so we'll slaughter in the name of Christ. Basically a very, 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 you know, demeaning look at the Crusaders.
I think if we were to sum up, you know, kind of everything that we've been leading up to, which is, you know, where are we going, you know, from here in terms of, you know, the depiction of the Crusades in popular history or in popular culture. You know, it'd be, I think right now we're entering into a very conflicted period where you have there's a lot of variety out there now. And I think there's a lot that's positive. There's a lot that's negative. And I do feel like the the needle is starting to shift back towards a more balanced view. If it's, maybe it's not there already. I would not say that we're there yet. But I do believe we are getting there, especially as more and more people become genuinely interested in the real history of that period, of that particular period. I think there's going to be more of a demand. I know I've seen it. I know I've seen, trailers for, obviously very pop culture depictions of the medieval period in general. And they're just like, the comments are just getting savaged by people who are like, this is horrifically inaccurate. This is not the way it was, So I think there is gradually a growing demand for more balanced, more historically and academically accurate portrayals of those eras, which is not going to jive with the modern portrayals, with the modern or the postmodern portrayals of that era. Because if we're really being honest with ourselves here, and maybe this is a controversial statement to make, but if we're really being honest with ourselves, the modern and postmodern portrayals of that period are deeply rooted in ideology, not actual fact.
No question.
It's deeply rooted. People are the modern and postmodern depiction of the medieval period is almost 100% derived from Enlightenment era ideology that was very anti-religious, very anti organized religion, had a lot of Orientalism influenced to it, and is not historical, is not in line with the actual historical facts. And I think the more that people demand accurate depictions of that period in popular culture, you are going to get a more balanced depiction as we go forward. At least that's my hope. Maybe call me an optimist. Maybe we'll get to see it in our lifetimes. I don't know.
I think what you said is definitely evident in the popularity of historical YouTube channels nowadays, especially ones like our own, and of course others like Kings and Generals and History Time. Channels like this that focus on this era. There's a huge demand for that kind of stuff because people really want to know the genuine history that's not, marred by ideology and distortions.
Yeah.
And I think, also, I think the excitement generated by Stephen's Knights of the Cross TV series that's coming out eventually.
Very much.
I think, I pray this is the case. Best case scenario is that this show really marks a turning point in how the Crusades are depicted in popular media.
I hope so. I really do.
Specifically film and television, because that is currently the main way, most popular means of disseminating things like that.
Yep. Scott, do you have any last comments to make? Oh, we may have lost Scott. But well, hey, like I said, thank you to all of you who've listened in. I think this is absolutely our we've smashed our record of live streams. I don't think we've ever had a live stream this long, and we really appreciate you all listening in. Unfortunately, I think we wish we could have gotten to maybe some more some questions of yours, but we're running late as we are. Guys, I'll turn it over to Peter and Scott if they have any last comments. But other than that, we really appreciate you all tuning in and listening. Hit our like button, subscribe, and hopefully we'll be seeing you again in the future.
Rand said it all. Thanks a lot, guys, for tuning in, and for those of you who stuck around the whole time, we salute you.
I want to thank our audience and thank you all. It was a great program.
All right. And with that, we're signing off. Deus Vult.
Deus Vult. See you next time.
Later. Deus Vult.